If there's video, is this a podcast?
It's a video podcast.
I'm not sure if that's a thing yet.
It is. It is a thing. It's a very big thing.
It's like generative design.
I feel. Well, I do like the format that you guys are doing because, like, in general, there's like most of the time presentations in AEC are like, they're presented in a way that, like, look how awesome this is.
Yeah.
And everyone knows it's like, it's not always how it works.
Yeah,
So,
the shiny bits are shown. Well, we've been trained that. I mean, that's part of our background. If we're trained as architects, typically we're trained to hide the warts as much as possible and show like the best parts of the process.
Yeah.
And not really discuss the challenges. And that's, in practice, it's all about the challenges.
I'm always disappointed in panel discussions in like AEC technology events. Because the point of the panel discussion is the discussion among a group of people that have similar and opposing viewpoints, and there should be some sort of debate or discussion about a concept. And usually what happens is that the panels get organized, everyone talks about their work for 10 minutes, like a 10 to 20 minute intro, and then there's like 10 or 5 to 10 minutes at the end. That's always like, okay, now we can do questions. And they're like, okay, you can't really get into the mix with a good discussion.
It's very difficult to have a meaningful conversation in that framework and context.
Yeah.
And then 9 times out of 10, it's hijacked by a guy that gets up and like asks a question that's not a question. It's just a really long statement.
I've got first a comment, and then I'll get to a question at the end, and then
They never do.
Yeah, then they never do. It's actually, do you want to be a part of this panel? Maybe next time we'll think of you, but probably not.
Yeah.
Under the bus to whoever you are. So let's introduce Matt. Episode 2. This episode's focused on, building, I would say, innovation in a big ship, big company. Matt Goldsberry from HDR is a digital design principal. Matt and I kind of go way back. I remember when I think I was in 4th year undergrad at University of Nebraska. And it's hard to describe the setup, but you had different studios that were stacked on each other. In fact, the studio system's called the stacks. And I was sitting there working on my project, and I see this kid just below me in the year right behind me, and and I looked over. I'm like, is he doing curvy stuff?
yeah.
At the University of Nebraska? Like, I was like kind of blown. I'm like, wow, okay, cool. There's actually there's a talented kid down there, and sure enough, we kind of became friends pretty quickly after that.
I do remember Nate having this really terrible computer.
Like a gateway that like barely ran by the time like we started hanging out.
But you were cranking out these huge, crazy models, and I was just thinking, like, how is he able to even make that geometry?
How is the computer not melting on his desk right now?
And I don't know how I was able to do it. I mean, it was like kind of, I think part of it has to do with just being patient enough to put up with crashing and then trying to just make slight tweaks to get it to actually go.
I think in 3rd year, I was obsessed with the, they called modifiers in 3D Max, but the modifiers, and then that was like the trick to do, like, organic mesh modeling.
Yeah, we were it was like the big thing at that time to get into like the technique driven modeling, right? You would kind of compose a series of modifiers on top of each other to get this kind of unique.
But at the same time, what we were being trained was like hand drafting.
Yeah, that's what made, I think, some of that upbringing challenging. I think for folks like us that were very, I think, at an early point in our interests as students, we were kind of really gravitating towards the computer as like a design process tool. But there really wasn't a mechanism there it was really very much self-guided, which I appreciated in a lot of ways. It sort of like allowed me to find something that worked for whatever I was interested in. But it was also frustrating in that there wasn't anyone there to sort of tell you what the approach could be or should be, and
So I went from my fourth year, I transferred to SCI-Arc, and it's probably one of the two most extreme, schools to go to. From literally learning hand drafting.
The pedagogy between the two is pretty starkly different.
I mean, we were building physical models by, you buying like basswood, and then like no laser cutting like
really wasn't a thing when in undergrad.
Yeah, like you would measure.
Oh yeah. You sit there with your X-Acto and your ruler, and you cut the wood, and
But cutting basswood takes a long time.
Yeah, especially if you want a good clean cut. You gotta go over it and over it again and again, and get it just so. It's very time consuming.
And then when I got accepted for a semester at SCI-Arc, like I had to be there in like less than a week.
Right.
So I drove 24 hours. I showed up at SCI-Arc, like nowhere to live. So I went to the computer lab to try to find like a place on Craigslist. And there were like students clearly from Hernan's studio. And they had like been up all night, and they had their renderings going on the screen. And I was like, where am I? Because where I come from, we do that. We sketch by hand, and then it just didn't make any sense. But it was so that was in 2002. So that was like the end of like the 90s era of the Hernan studios.
Right.
With the, I guess what do you call the Maya technique of the unit.
Sort of like
it was like the manual L system of like
sort of like modulating
technique.
The
extreme modular.
Yeah, extreme modular. I don't even want to know if I would call it a style. It was kind of a narrative style in a way. It was much more about. It was very much derived from like cinematic kind of understanding of architecture in a lot of ways. There was certainly a great deal of storytelling, but also quite a bit of fetishizing of the technique to get some kind of visual effect.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it was pretty cool. I mean, it was pretty exciting to like be there and see that. But
yeah, I mean, the contrast that you would get coming from like a place like Nebraska and jumping into that, and also the experience of being in Los Angeles is really interesting when you first get there. I mean, it very like I remember when I moved there out of school and started working. It's very raw in a lot of ways. It's people just there's a level of anarchy. People are just kind of trying new things all the time, especially in the schools that are present in LA. And then you went to China.
Yeah, right after that, and studied there, worked there a little bit, which I think there's kind of an odd connection because like we were both in Nebraska. Doing different things. We're both in LA doing different things, and then we were actually in China doing different things too, because you were working on the project and I was just there running around looking at warehouses.
So what years were you at SCI-Arc?
I was there, let's see, in 02, spring of 06, spring of 06, and then summer Beijing studio there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your undergrad kind of spanned, and going up into grad school basically spanned that earliest part of the 21st century, right? Like your early 2000s, which was really where there was the primary transition for everybody to become digital. Like everything became digital at that point in time. Obviously there was a lot of pioneers before that, and there was a ton of 2D CAD everywhere, which still is around. But like right around that time is when most practices were really shifting almost all of their work that was meaningful in terms of late stage design and production into the digital. Like that's a really interesting time, because it was when computing power became enough that you could really run large models and the software that was available was robust enough that you could rely on it to produce the kind of drawings that you needed. That's a pretty interesting time to like begin practice, I'd say.
Right.
And Maya was mainstream, but there was no actual fabrication going on at the time.
It was very much a digital experiment, right?
And I think, I believe, didn't Neil Denari attempt to lead SCI-Arc for a little bit and become fully digital, but I don't know if that.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I mean, I'm sure there's people that are watching this that might be able to kind of correct us and comment on some of those milestones, because there's like there's these different eras of leadership at SCI-Arc that really spearheaded different types of initiatives, and obviously Neil Denari had a big influence on the direction of that school for a time, and
and then Moss played it out for a long time.
Yeah,
which he did a great job, and now Hernan's pushing it.
Yep.
Fabrication studio is pretty extreme over there now.
Yeah, I mean there has been
studio.
Yeah, there has been like a pretty significant shift everywhere towards the digital fabrication conversation, especially in academia, and you can kind of see that in the Acadia conferences, especially in the last 10 years as they've progressed. It's digital's always been a part of it, but this notion of research into digital fabrication and the use of digital physical methods has really taken hold and being a driving force in
there's a lot that's tied to not just the fabrication and being run through robotics and these kinds of things, but there's also a lot being pulled in from the material world in academia,
right?
So it's like how do you program your digital model so that it accommodates for really more sophisticated material behaviors? So there's this total focus on that kind of connection between the digital and the material through fabrication.
Yep.
The academia's been hung up on it now for 15 years, or 12 to 15 years. It's been a while.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
So I'm curious how that experiment plays out. Now that fabrication has been embedded in academia for so long. I mean, it seems like currently it's being implemented as just knowledge of being able to work with fabricators.
Right.
But
yeah, I think that's one of the larger problem areas that at least and biggest disconnects I see between academia and professional practice. It almost seems that there's been a bit of a bubble created around digital fabrication in academia, to the point where these experiments are so esoteric and driven by just the interests of the researcher, and very rarely do we start to see a lot of these things make their way into practice. And then practice is, I think, really hindered by this sort of risk aversion that comes with this idea that, okay, well, as a designer, I'm able to kind of construct and develop this scheme, and it's going to have these components, and it may even have this sort of complex geometry embedded into it and these really novel ideas. But then the barrier becomes, how does this actually interface with the manufacturer or the fabricator? And contractual obligations start to prevent that. And if it does happen, it's almost like a behind the scenes handshake agreement. Here's my model, use it, but I don't want to be liable for anything. There's a real disconnect with how that starts to really play out and be.
But I don't know how you would play that out in academia either. It's like we played out the full digital era, 90s, early 2000s, and now playing out, digital fabrication. I'm curious where it goes next.
There's just very different constraints that exist in professional practice and academia right now, and I think it's something that can unpack for a really long time. But it is the constraints of really building a building that people are going to occupy. You have to accommodate for code. You have to accommodate for client needs. There's real life constraints that academia is unburdened by. And academia is uninterested in typically.
Right.
So they're like the interest in research is on almost anything but those constraints.
Yeah.
Which is probably in the long run, or in the mid run at least, problematic to finding a way to bridge kind of the knowledge, because there's a lot of knowledge being produced in academia.
Yeah.
It's just how do you apply it, and how do you create a good bridge to it. And that actually, you wonder, like, for your position where you are at HDR, like, how is that even anywhere on a radar screen for what you're doing?
Let's zoom ahead here. So, you were in SCI-Arc, you went to UCLA after your China experience, and I remember you dabbled in perhaps even doing work in entertainment for a while.
Yeah.
And you kind of made a play in Hollywood and really wanted to understand. I think pre-visualization was a thing for you for a bit.
Yeah. At I forget the name, but Ron Frankel. Just did a little internship there, worked a little bit. Well, I think, which is very common at like SCI-Arc and UCLA, to go work
Right.
in special effects. I think the one thing I took away from that is the extreme customization that goes on in special effects. I mean, everyone
Customization and specialization in the digital workflow. I mean,
You're the hair guy.
Yeah, you're the hair guy, and you're going to be the person in the next Avengers movie that's going to be worried about this one wrinkle on Thanos' chin, and you better make sure that wrinkle looks spot on, and for the next 2 years, that's what you're going to do.
Well, yeah. With that, there's like the I mean, with like Pixar and some of these big special effects houses. Yeah, I mean, you can never have a pipeline specialist like just in architecture, because I mean, you just don't have that many resources
Right.
for a project. But that's like a huge role.
And you look at, you just look at the credits at the end of any, Disney movie or, special effects driven movie these days. And it's like, it gets to the CG team. I remember the first time I saw this was like Iron Man 3. It was I think when the Marvel movies really started doing it, where it's just like, all of a sudden you just see this wall of names go up, and you're just like, holy shit. Like, that's how many people went into the visual effects of this.
Yeah, because like in AEC, we're always talking about like the latest like software, the like Enscape, all these tools. But in like special effects, it's like you just have a team, you just make whatever you want. Like, like Disney has, I forget the render engine that they have, but
I think it's RenderMan.
Yeah, RenderMan.
I think they're using RenderMan. It's crazy. Yeah, I mean, and every year you look at the SIGGRAPH papers, SIGGRAPH being the conference that is most focused on visual effects. And it's crazy. I mean, that's research that's really advanced, and they're really closely interfaced with science. And there's a lot of simulation that's going on that's incredibly sophisticated.
Right.
And they can do that. I mean, that's all they need to do is it's all about creating that single effect. And it's also all hands on deck. Like it doesn't have to be standardized. So long as it looks good and it's the right thing, like the whole aim is to have something that works. So in some ways it's really different. I mean, it's obviously very different, but it's almost like making a sausage. You can do whatever it is that you need to do, you do. And then like, that's how you get that particular effect. And then you can go back to that, or, that can become normalized. But like, it's kind of the Wild West. It's interesting space. It's a very interesting space.
I mean, it's a combination of the amount of like resources and talented people. I mean, for example, you could do like a render with just like, 4 objects, but if you have 2 artists building custom mats, and then you drop it on the object, and you're gonna have this like beautiful image. But you would never have those types of resources, like in the AEC. Like you wouldn't just have an artist to make you any mat that you need.
Right. So then zooming ahead, you and I both ended up in Nebraska again. That's a question. I don't know if you get this a lot, but I always get it. It's like, oh, you're in Omaha. Why Omaha? So for you, why Omaha? Why are you in Nebraska?
Well, so when I graduated UCLA in 2011, which was a pretty dismal time in LA. I mean, not only were there not jobs, but there was like, firms were like closing down.
Right. It was still like, just on that in the wake of the crash.
Yeah. And so graduating, I mean, it seemed like in retrospect, it seemed like good timing because it was like the end of the crash, but nobody had any idea how long it was gonna.
There's still recovery to
last.
do. Yeah.
So yeah, and there's a lag always in building, so there's a recovery, and then it takes time before people really believe there's enough of a recovery that they're going to invest in construction again. So takes time.
Yeah. I think people were just lucky to get a job in general at all. So I was kind of doing little consulting jobs around town, and then an old boss
here in Omaha, you were doing like consulting
in LA.
In LA, you were doing the consulting gig, and then
I had an old boss, Tom Turnerlin, call me up and see if I wanted to do a little 2-month consulting gig in Omaha for HDR. And then I came and tested it out. I figure, got to make some money, especially after all those student loans.
Yeah, because going to SCI-Arc is not cheap,
Or
and
UCLA.
UCLA is not cheap.
Yeah, we could have a whole discussion on student loans.
We could get into a whole couple of hours on that subject alone.
Yeah, you might get hundreds of comments just on the effects of student loans in architecture.
I'll be sure to put that in the tags of the video and really pinpoint this part of the discussion. But I mean,
it's relevant for everybody.
It's really relevant.
Yeah.
The cost of architecture education is not cheap, and it's known. I mean, out of all possible majors, architecture is, I think, typically up there as one of the top most expensive fields to go into.
It's usually at least an extra year. And then in many cases now it's a 6-year program, so that you can do your 4-year undergraduate and then your 2-year professional degree is quite common. Whereas many other majors, you do it in 4 years and you're done. And you're ready to go out there. So that's like 50% more. and you're starting your career a little bit later. It's a rough gig.
Well, I mean, it's got to take a hit on the industry too, because with all the students' loans, you can't just start up a firm because
you're settled.
Yeah, you got to pay. Like
you got. I mean, being able to take the risk of starting a business, you have to be in a place where there's some level of security, and I can speak to that. I mean, just for myself. I mean, I don't know that if I didn't have the client base that I had from when I was previously at Case, that I would have been able to start with Proving Ground. And it's hard to start it up from scratch, especially when you've got student loans, and which I had as well for.
I mean, even historically, a lot of the big architects that we think of had some sort of in to start way, one way or another.
Yeah, and I mean, that's not even considering licensure. If like you want to start up a firm as an architect, I mean, we're a different animal. But if you want to be an architect, you got to get that license, and to get that license, you got to work for somebody else. So, it's a.
So you've
not easy.
You made the trip to Nebraska. You joined up with Tom Trenalone at HDR, which he's an interesting character from an Omaha design community standpoint. You and I both had the chance to work with him when we were at Randy Brown Architects, both as interns. And he was really trying to start something different and he was really a driver of cultural change at HDR, kind of helping the company move towards the direction of being a design-led company. And I think bringing in people like you were part of that, and bringing in kind of this novel background in digital, but you also had a very strong design eye, and you were able to, just kind of think differently than I think other architects that might be in this region. Talk about that a little bit. Talk about how the studio.
Yeah, I mean, when I started at HDR, I was certainly uncertain about it. I mean, just you graduate from school, and I guess there's a fantasy of just being able to work for a small boutique firm and do really cool work.
The black capes.
Yeah, but when you start working, you realize there's just a lot of different routes. And once I started working a little bit at HDR, it's like if you have ideas and you have goals, and you want to achieve those, like you can do at these larger firms, there's things you can do, and you can get momentum, you can get people behind you, you can get resources. There's always ways to do R&D. It may not be a full R&D studio, but you can get funding and people and ways to make things happen. And that's always been really exciting in the work, and I think it's probably why I've stuck around. So I've been there now 7 years.
Yep.
And I think when I first started off, just working in a design studio, and then sort of migrated towards computational design. We were talking about these words earlier, but the nomenclature of digital design, computational design,
generative design
always feels a little uncomfortable.
It's kind of I think a symptom of it really being a pretty open-ended, undefined thing, and people are just now starting to figure out computational design as being a real thing, and being a thing worth pursuing for a big practice. And I remember, I was kind of in a very similar trajectory myself when I was, first graduated school. I started up at a boutique firm in Los Angeles when I moved out there. I found out that wasn't for me, at least the firm that I was with, and found my way into a corporate practice. And the sort of resources that you're given can be a huge benefit to someone that might be wanting to try some things. So it's a combination of both resources and then being able to convince people that are making decisions that it's a worthwhile thing to pursue. And one of the things I was interested in hearing about from you is like, if I think about all the work that we've collaborated on over the years, and where HDR started around the time that you joined, there's been a lot of change in the company, and there's been a lot of change management that's had to occur because of this. And also, it's been a long kind of process. It's not like in a year HDR had a computational design team. It took them like 7 years, because where you're at now versus where you started, it's very different. I was wondering if you could talk about where that started and some of the steps along the way that it really took to get there.
I think at first, 7 years ago, there was definitely a huge shift in, for one, making HDR design focused, which...
How big is HDR, by the way, for everyone? How many people on the HDR architecture side?
Yeah, so HDR Architecture, I think, is around 2,500.
Yeah.
Well, that's worldwide.
Worldwide, yeah. And then HDR overall is, I think, more towards 10,000. But that's, we're huge in engineering, civil engineering.
Yep.
All kinds of fields on that side.
Yep.
But still, 2,500 in architecture, it's pretty big. And,
it's not a small boat.
And to say that you want to go from being what might traditionally be called a production-oriented shop to something that's more oriented towards design is no small feat for a firm of that size. It's a lot of momentum to shift.
So there was, they certainly made a huge shift that way, and then along that way was investments in technology and research, and then I found myself on the path of kind of pushing these technologies for a lot of reasons. I think a lot of people start off in kind of doing computational design just with like Rhino, Grasshopper, and trying to automate your workflows and things like that, and then it just starts to move into other areas.
Right.
So I think especially at HDR we have huge resources in data analysis and sustainability and industrial engineers, and then when you start collaborating with these people and figuring out how you can incorporate this stuff into those expertise, especially with like planning expertise, you can just get a ton of momentum and a ton of things rolling all at the same time. So something like, for instance, like collaborating with our data scientists was something that didn't really think about before as like something you would do for a project. In the last couple of years, we've been doing a ton of that. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that we do on our data science dive, stuff related to like, more like GIS and program development and population health data and things like that. But then all kinds of other things like machine vision.
Where do you see most of the applications for that type of work, and in relation to the architectural practice that HDR brings to the table?
I think probably the biggest is meeting clients early on and realizing that every one of their ideas or goals is almost like completely unique. I mean, we always think like, clients come to us and they're like ready to build a building and it's going to be this size and they just need our help with designing it and figuring it out. But even just one step before that, there's a ton of, and then you go one step before that too, which is, working with them just to figure out like, what are the possibilities of like 20 years from now? And then the complexities of like a master plan saying like, if you optimize moving all these departments over here, you add another building over here. If you predict what fields are going to exist and how you might grow. So it's not just like predicting a couple scenarios, it's playing out, hundreds of scenarios, and each one of those scenarios has different, logistics with each one. So
it's really about, you're kind of describing operational modeling. You're getting into not just, you're proposing that it's not just about designing a building, it's about really helping a client, an owner, figure out their business model with the building, it seems.
Yeah, and it's one thing to like have a conversation with the client about this, and it's another to go through the exercise of getting tons of data for like how they access the building, like Wi-Fi data, and getting historical information from them, and getting population data, and overlapping all that, and then playing out hundreds of blocking and stacking options. Like being able to deal with that level of complexity is, I think, what clients are, wanting.
Is it at the point now where you feel like they're starting to really expect it, or is it just, or is it, do you surprise them with what you're bringing to the table, or is it some kind of mix of that?
Probably a little bit of mix, but I think in general they're usually pretty typically surprised that we can handle being able, because I think in general, like if you're not even familiar with like just a lot of technologies in general, like just basic machine vision seems unattainable. Like how you would collect the data and then how you would actually turn that into something is not something people just think like, oh, we could track all the people with a camera or a sensor and then we'll know volumes of people, and then that will help indicate us projecting out.
So when you're working with the client on that example, you would say, okay, well, you know what, what are your current needs? How do you know your current needs? We can help you figure out what your current needs are because we can measure things. And then you actually would set up a rig and go in and actually track and set those kinds of things up. So it's like a pre-data collection even before they engage in the next stage of how they're going to design what they need next.
I mean, historically, we've always come in, like just AC in general is like, you have typical services, and that's just how contracts work. It's like you do a feasibility study, you do a schematic design package, and it's pretty common what fees across the industry are for that. But it's very unknown territory, like before that, of how you attain the data, what do you do with it, how do you visualize it, all that stuff.
And even like with the feasibility is a response to a program or to a brief, and actually designing that brief is something that historically the client has been responsible for. But what you're suggesting is that actually there's real opportunity to get in and help and take the expertise that you have from the actual design process and say, hey, we can help you formulate this in a way that's more intelligent and that's going to anticipate what your long-term needs are a little bit differently.
Yeah, and I think what becomes interesting is when we just talk to them and figure out what they need and just tell them like, well, you could do this. rather than just trying to go in and say, oh yeah, this is our lineup of services.
And it's a I think the sweet spot for any architecture firm is to be in that position where you're a trusted advisor. And it seems like what you're building with these types of services is a possibility for a form of consulting that helps build this level of trust early on, where if that owner has a question about the future of their facility or the future of their master plan, like, we need to contact HDR to help us figure this out, because they have the data on us, and they've been able to make these informed decisions with us and help us right size these processes and these efforts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like one thing that comes to mind is like dealing with benchmarking. It's an extremely difficult problem that you guys probably know or deal with a lot more than we deal with a lot, and there's a lot of different ways we do it.
Yeah.
But it's certainly at some level comprehensive, but it's hard because there's just so many components to like benchmarking projects.
Because every project has its kind of own unique. It's got its own unique context, right? In some ways, I mean, there's comparables. You can probably find if you're working on a new medical facility, given the breadth of your portfolio in that area, you can probably find comparables. But then the question becomes, okay, well, each of those projects has, is in a different location, a different client altogether, a different business plan that probably went behind it, potentially slightly different operational models given the,
there's always a but.
Right.
There's always it's similar, but there's this, and there's similar, but there's this, and that goes, that's assuming that the data itself from prior projects is in any kind of recognizable or consistent format. I mean, you can get into the weeds, into the challenges of sort of having an effective benchmarking strategy, or even remotely approaching an effective implementation of it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and part of that is like the firm's standards are evolving, and so a project that may have been designed 10 years ago may have been designed under very different standards. So then, how do you kind of unpack that data and compare it to new information? And then there's the challenges of the proprietary software we use. I mean, can you imagine opening up a Revit 2008 model today and trying to get to that information and put it to meaningful use, and would that data even be relevant anymore? I think is a big question from a technology side.
Yeah, I mean, isn't the promise that we can just load up our Revit models?
That's the promise.
How sophisticated are these BIM models that the industry creates?
I think there's, from what we see, is it's all over the map. It's kind of the wild west when it comes to how well a firm is pursuing the use of Revit and the application of BIM in a meaningful way. I mean, there's firms that just say, it's just another production tool, and it's primarily used to crank out documents, and so model quality is not really a concern. But then you do have firms that are taking the model side really seriously and trying to implement ways of using the model long term, and then there are firms that haven't even touched Revit and aren't really even and it's probably a surprising number of firms that haven't even gone into the BIM conversation that we very rarely talk about, I think, when we talk about technology. And so it's all over the map, right? It's like I would say it's wide adoption of the tools when it comes to like BIM. Revit's very widely adopted, but very inconsistently adopted.
Yeah, it's deployed completely differently from firm to firm, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's good for firms to have a culture that plays to their strength. But still, there's definitely people sabotaging themselves with the way that they resist certain implementations. There's a lot of issues.
In that context, I think it becomes very interesting then to talk about computational design in that same light, because here you have almost a completely different tool and a completely different use case. Computational design makes no claim that you're cranking out documents. There's no kind of dialogue around that. and jumps right into the designing of algorithms, which and the design of processes, which I think in firm to firm is still the Wild West. But it's interesting to think about how, in your case, how a firm like HDR, who's making these moves, as you say when you first joined them, making these moves to work towards design, looked at computation and were like, you know what, this is something that we really need to get on. What did that switch look like? When did the light bulb go off in, say, some of the decision makers' minds that they're like, holy shit, like we need to invest in this and we need to get people skilled up? When did that start to happen, you think?
When it didn't happen is when you use these tools. We use these tools for all kinds of stuff, but early on when you use it for design,
form making,
or just rationalization of the form. I think
that was less interesting to people.
It's certainly less interesting to people. I mean, it's interesting the fact that like, oh, cool, we could do that.
But then it's very much local to that part of that project that you're working on. It's not like informing any kind of global strategy.
And a project manager would look at, like, say, a really cool like implementation of like a of a geometry driven process, but then always be able to say like, yeah, it's really cool, but my teams don't do that.
Yeah, exactly.
So you looked at it like kind of a different kind of set.
Well,
of
yeah,
approaches.
I mean, early on, I mean, the use cases were when you're like in design development, and you're doing like a facade and you're like rationalizing it, or you're doing all kinds of stuff, or even in production and you're using Dynamo to automate certain tasks. But in general, nobody cares about that because you're only making less work for yourself.
Right. It's kind of behind the scenes. It's behind the scenes automation. Kind of you're working on the plumbing of the project in a way. You're like, yeah, I'm going to make this work much faster for myself and perhaps my team. But
yeah, I mean, you could have the best Dynamo library of automation scripts,
right,
and still nobody would be that impressed. like your peers would be impressed. You'd be like, wow, this guy works pretty fast.
Right,
like
but it would just be about that. It wouldn't go up the ladder in terms of being something where it was going to move practice, change the focus of how practice is implemented. It's more just, oh, okay, well, this project seemed to go a little bit faster, or it was a little bit steadier. There were fewer mistakes, maybe. Maybe there was more precision. The automation allowed for you to do more things, but no one was really associating that innovation with a change in fundamental practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it really started to catch on is when clients started seeing this as like an opportunity to like help them make decisions. Like when you can show them a tool and for whatever reason it automates, whether it makes the blocking and stacking faster, or you can see the data, or a whole number of things. But when clients can see the impact of this tool is helping me think through the problem like faster or differently, then it becomes like,
or more clearly.
Yeah, then it becomes a game changer for like we're using this to make decisions.
At what point in time? So when you started at HDR, you were working on projects as an architect on projects, and then at some point you shifted into your towards your current role, where maybe you're more like an internal consultant. There's an awareness that you had this specialization where you could more broadly impact projects. When did that happen, and how did that transition come about?
I think probably the biggest transition was 4 years ago when we were heavily involved on this project for new hospital for UPenn, and we concocted this crazy way of helping the team think through cost. I always get in trouble when I say cost model, because we say cost model because we're getting numbers, but it's really more like an automated way of getting quantities and being able to visualize that and do options.
It's interesting that you kind of pulled that back right then, because it does start to speak to, in some ways, the danger of kind of misrepresenting an algorithm or a process in a way that might be tied to someone else's scope of work, like the contractors, right?
Yeah, they get really upset when we say that we can do a cost model because they have very complicated spreadsheets, and they will offer up certain versions of that we can tap into.
But it's like an early estimation tool. You can claim that. You know?
But I mean, every single project ever deals with cost early on. Like, how do you do a cost early on?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember days of Rhino and SketchUp where, you get a surface, you type area,
multiply that.
You get the area, you put it in your Excel spreadsheet, multiply by the cost per square foot, and then you don't even run the calculation. You just get the department and the area, and then you send that as a spreadsheet to the contractors. But so we had done some crazy tools with grasshoppers to help the automation of that, and then also visualize that.
And to optioneer with it, basically, to say, hey, well, if we do this, this is the impact here, and if we make these assumptions. So basically allowing for, like you were saying before, a client-facing engagement where you can talk through what the impacts of different decisions are going to be at an early stage.
So I remember the most interesting thing to me about that entire setup was how it was being workshopped on with the client. I mean, it was all about you getting in the room or someone from the team being in the room. You got the tools on the screen. You've got questions about the project being asked, and then you're adapting the model with the client in this kind of workshop manner. And from kind of working with you on similar things on other projects as well, it kind of seems that's become a bit of a trend, right? Because this idea of the workshop style interview, and the expectation that clients want you in the room to work on these different things, being able to bring these tools to bear in a very visual way is very provocative and very powerful, right?
I think a couple months ago we went into a project meeting. I think we've kind of finally hit nirvana because we went in with the Rhino model and the Power BI dashboard, and we could splice up the model any way we wanted and drill down to quantities any way we wanted. So there was no diagramming, there's no drawings, there's no like paper handouts. I remember I was in a meeting a couple months ago, and like developer handed me like a print off of his like PowerPoint slides, and it was like, caught me off guard. I forgot that that's like still standard practice to like print off your slides and hand them out. I have no idea what I'm going to do with these.
So it's like, do you choose one slide per page, or two slides, or three slides? You know, with notes.
Yeah, are the notes in there or not?
But I mean, there's a lot of things that have happened in the last 5 years to make that possible. Right. I mean, for instance, like with Rhino 6 and like the Arctic mode and their engine to visualize the model. I mean, it looks like a rendering just by going to render mode.
You know, what that reminds me of is that, I think before Rhino and Grasshopper was used this way in this context, in some ways the prototype for that process, and I know that there's going to be people that are going to watch this are going to groan, do a big face palm when I say the prototype for that process was kind of SketchUp, wasn't it? Is people would bring their SketchUp model to these workshops, and they would bring it to these workshops because people liked the way it looked, and people got into like the sort of fun factor of what the default SketchUp look was like. And now we've got these types of tools with and I know the work that you do, because it always looks really good, and that's really important, right, in this context.
Yeah, I mean, historically, that's how we always win in every meeting, right? You do the the V-Ray render, the all white render, and you get your diagram, and then you draw your annotation,
leader lines, and all this stuff. Yeah.
I mean, I remember. It was a crazy process because you would do these like 3-hour renders, and then you would bring it into Illustrator, and then you do your annotation, and then you put it back all in InDesign because you got multiple pages. You need to do your titles and all that, and everything's kind of lined up just right. So you go from InDesign and then in PowerPoint, and it had to line up perfect, because if you go from slide to slide, things need to line up, and if it's slightly off,
Yeah, with that little shift.
yeah. So
just
you spend hours
breaks
just
it.
like getting that little
Yeah.
shift
Yeah.
to line up.
So let me ask you a really important question. Do you ever use the extended sketch lines in Rhino? Do you ever try to get that sketch look? Give me some of that sketch look.
Is that a feature?
I think it's possible.
I
Is it possible?
I thought that was just
I don't
Revit.
know.
If it's not, it should be possible. We need more sketch lines.
There is one feature that should be removed from
What's that?
Rhino, which
What's
is is it called Sketch?
Yeah, it's kind of like makes it look like it's sitting on a piece of trace paper,
Yeah.
like one of those default visual modes.
Who
It's like pen mode.
who's using it? I mean, I guess maybe like if you
It's like, don't look at me.
I don't know.
I guess maybe like in automotive industry where like you do a quick form and then you do the sketch mode. That's pretty popular.
Yeah. Well, they have like the mechanical drawing mode. I mean, there is some fetishization of the visualization, but it's actually the thing that is interesting about it is that it's important, right? I mean, to your practice, clearly the quality of the visual content is pretty key, like to how to making your client feel like they're in professional hands. Like it has to look good. Like it can't not look good.
And you'll hear this from project architects all the time, and people doing the presenting is that, hey, this client responds best to this style of image.
Yeah.
And that is still, even in the sort of space of data-driven parametric modeling, computational algorithms, oftentimes what comes down to getting an idea sold is what the decision maker is able to respond to, which I think creates a very interesting challenge for this. And some people get very easily seduced by data. Other people get seduced by like how it's going to look in a specific style. And I think you have to really strategize that, right?
Well, that was always the argument to use SketchUp over Rhino too, which was like just default SketchUp mode.
Clients like that look. Like they nailed it. They got that look.
I remember there was we put together a Rhino training at Case, and there was actually a whole section of this Rhino training curriculum that we put together that was all about how can I make Rhino look like SketchUp, it sounds really dumb, but it got people into certain parts of customizing Rhino's visual style, and it sounds really trivial, but it's still very much important, I think, right?
Yeah, and so there's the Rhino visual component, which is like be able to drill down quickly between floors and options and all that. And then the other component was the Power BI component. That's like the last couple of years kind of exploded into a huge community. So there's all these free visual styles that you can drop on. And then the tool that we've been working on with you guys that we can connect both the Rhino workflow with Power BI. And in a room where you got two screens set up, and one's like Rhino and one's your Power BI dashboard. I mean, Power BI, like compared to like Excel days, I mean, I remember building dashboards in Excel, and I mean, it's like sketching out a diagram by hand.
Right.
The amount of effort to get involved to make it even look like anything.
Well, and it doesn't have the benefit of these tools is that they're part of a conversation. They respond to change. And so they allow for a sense that even if it's highly curated, even if you're walking somebody through it, there's a sense that the narrative engagement is what's creating the new information. And typically it is like, someone can say, well, what if we do this? And having that ability to do that allows for people to actually engage with the information more actively, rather than just feeling like they're being thrown something at them, but instead they can actually have a conversation with the data.
I think this is really where there's a sort of a pretty powerful point of entry for architects in this space, especially in the digital space, even the ones that might be the most adverse to adopting new processes. And that's the aspect of storytelling with these things. And I think architects are excellent storytellers. Architects know how to tell the story of a building, the story of a space. You mentioned him earlier. Tom knows how to like go into a client interview with a story. And I think some of the best applications I've seen of the computational work that you guys do is somehow able to successfully marry the story of the architecture with the data to support that story. And not in the sense that you're, a storyteller in the sense that you're making things up, but you're really trying to combine the overall effect of an exciting space with then the sort of metrics to back it up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think our latest work has been focused on leveraging gaming tools like Unity and Unreal.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of it's basically taking that, what I was describing as the Rhino Power BI, and then making it that experience that then you can just hand over and then use. You can pull all the levers and push all the buttons
and get that visual information, which is really communicating the design idea. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, is creating that. Some other stuff that's really interesting about it is like, your team does for sure do a lot of like really deep dives into really sophisticated metrics. I mean, I know a lot of the stuff you're doing in water treatment, like you're, even working in engineering kind of grade information networks, like those kinds of data structures you're engaging with. But a lot of the ones that are most important for engaging with a client are fairly straightforward. They're not, it doesn't even have to be that complex.
Right.
But capturing it in an effective way is still really challenging. I mean, it's not trivial to do that and to put together that kind of framework. So I think that it is kind of a real innovation, I think, that you guys have been putting together.
So you've got a couple of project wins under your belt. The project that you mentioned before at UPenn, and I know that there have been this series of project wins over a not insignificant period of time, where it sort of started to really build a case that there was a real business value to this work. And now you're in a position where you're kind of leading it for the firm, which is, I think, another kind of interesting point to make. I mean, you entered the firm in this role of being a designer on Tom's team, and now you're a digital design principal, and you're kind of overseeing a whole host of things. So I'm curious to know, like, when it came to, I guess, really putting that together, and I know that your role is always evolving. Like, where do you see it going next? Like, is it something that you're like, hey, I'm really happy with what we're doing, and we're just going to keep pushing it forward? Are there any secrets that you might want to reveal on this podcast about what you intend to do with this position?
I think our secret or our weapon is I mean, we're huge, like I said, 2,000 on architecture, 10,000 engineering, but there's so many hyper specialized people across the company, and it's just incredible when you team up with one of those, some of the stuff that you can produce. Like, we have one person that specializes in machine learning, and just teaming up with that one person for a couple things is just crazy, the type of stuff we can do. But then just our experts across any industry. So, like, working with a single expert, say in, like, I think I was listening to the previous podcast, but you guys were just saying in relationship to generative design, like a planner can create more options than like you could create with
maybe not more, but I think arguably better.
Yeah.
Arguably better.
Probably better informed.
But so finding those expertise, and I think historically architecture, it's like, say for instance, like trying to do like data science. Like, I've seen like firms, you just try to spin up doing your own version of data analytics. But if you hire, if you have data scientists like in your company and you work with them to create something that combines the two things, is like, beyond anything that I would have thought we could have done previously.
You see,
So
that's
it's teaming is kind of where you're going to next in terms of identifying, well, you know, as HDR, you have these resources, you have these people that can do this. So in some ways, you're positioning yourself as an intermediary to leverage their expertise. And sort of through the tools that you've been developing and that you've been using, saying, hey, look, we can take your capabilities and we can actually inject that more efficiently and effectively into the design process.
Yeah, we had just one conversation having with a couple people in our wastewater group has turned into a huge initiative,
right,
and a whole infrastructure around the data system with like databases and simulations and planning tools and all kinds of stuff.
So to kind of wrap things up, I think what would be interesting is to get your take on and reflect back on this transformation that's occurring at HDR, and kind of how your career has progressed at HDR. I'm thinking back to some of the statistics that I hear about digital transformation and change management. You have this context where, you know, there have been surveys done that show that 84% of digital transformation initiatives often fail in companies, and only 1 in 3 change management initiatives actually succeeds. So, you know, a lot of the failures of these initiatives can kind of be stemmed back to, like, you know, failure to change behavior, failure to kind of really bring people along with the strategy. So if there's like one thing that you could recommend as someone who has seen quite a bit of success in your company when it comes to the adoption of these initiatives, and the embrace of computation, whether it's a small firm or a big firm, what's kind of the one thing that sticks out that makes you think, man, if other firms can do this, then they'll be successful?
Yeah. Well, I think, for one, nobody wants to be told what to do, for sure. And I think that a lot of times when people think of like design technology tools, they think of like, you know, I'm being told to use this because it makes me faster. But I think the success that we've seen is that it's like far more expansive than just purely automation tools. And when the tools, you know, when you can develop tools, create tools, deploy this stuff, and, you know, it's a design problem in itself, like both just how you implement it, what it looks like when you implement it, the reason why you implement it, and then when you package that up as this is what we did and it looks awesome, you know, that resonates with people, and they want to figure out how you did that, and they want to do it too. I can think of multiple instances where, you know, you created these series of automation tools, and it's like, man, if everyone used these, we would save millions of hours. But in the end, like, people just don't care that they could make that little workflow faster. I mean, some people just like to do what they do, and even though it might be a little bit slower, they get it done and they do it done right.
It's kind of like there's two components of this. I mean, there's the value of the tool to the overall process, but then there's the value of the tool to the person that's actually employing it, and the value needs to be demonstrated in both contexts.
And then when you're using these tools holistically, it's like, you know, there's my own personal benefit, which could be time saving or something else, but then there's also just, if I do this, like, the whole team's going to benefit, the client's going to benefit, and that's just the reason why you would.
Yeah, it's fundamentally the demonstration of the value, right? And being able to prove that a certain approach is better, and it's not implicit that an approach is going to be, just because it's digital, just because it's data driven, that doesn't mean that people are going to like embrace it and bring it into their process. The value needs to be proven.
Yeah, and these solutions have to be like flexible and holistic so that people can, you know, take this stuff and make it their own too. It's not just, you know, you plug it in and you hit a button. It's like you plug it in and I can do this and I can do this, and then now it's my own thing, and now I'm going to use this on everything.
The personalization part is really important.
In some sense, they need to be first shown what it can do, and be interested enough in the results to feel like it's something that they can engage in. And then the practice itself needs to be accessible and generalized enough that it changes the way that they work in a way that's kind of organic. I mean, it's a serious challenge, but it ultimately needs to be demonstrated in practice first. So there is that kind of, I think, chicken and egg thing. Like what, you can't force them to do it for the first time. So in some ways, you kind of need to lead the way yourself, and sort of show how these things can make for better outcomes. So it's a tricky thing for sure.
Demonstration, proof. Prove it.